With the 1999 update and everyone rushing to the new content, I thought I'd take a moment to go over one of the frames who got a little love recently, that being, I'm sure you've guessed by now, Nyx. But what I want to say has been a majority of the game's lifespan, Nyx has never really been too good. Back when I started playing over 7 years ago, she was just seen as a downgrade to Nova, as both frames focused on crowd control. Nova was objectively better, since she provided not only a better form of CC in a slow, but also increased the damage that CC enemies would take. But with this recent round of changes she's received, I thought it would be good to go over her powers, see what has changed and discuss how best to build and use her. Starting off with her passive then, formerly Nyx's passive caused enemies affected by her powers to be disarmed, similar to Loki's radial disarm, which was niche at the best of times and anti-synergetic at the worst. Her new passive is called Thirst for Chaos, which grants her 40% crit chance on primary and secondary weapons per target affected by mind control effects to a maximum cap of 200 at 5 enemies. Now, this effect is additive with mods, so put your Nucore and Sporothrix setups away, it's not going to work that well on those. Now, the question is what counts as mind control effects, and to put it simply, it's either any radiation proc inflicted by Nyx's abilities, weapons, or companions, and her first ability, mind control. Yeah, this includes companions, so if you build the Tazakor for max radiation and status chance, you can potentially max stack this ability without even needing to cast a single ability or shoot and use any of your weapons. It's really nice. With the new additions to the game such as the radiation damage mods and such a low requirement of 5 enemies to get stacked up, this is a really strong passive with a really easy activation requirement. Now, these enemies have to be active and alive for you to receive the buff, meaning that if you affect 5 enemies and one of them dies, you lose 40% of your crit chance from the buff, so keep that in mind. But if you're at 6 or higher and one of those enemies dies, it doesn't affect your buff, you still have at least 5 enemies under these mind control effects. Her first ability then is Mind Control. You target an enemy within 60 meters multiple by range and compel them to fight for you. Your mind control target will draw aggro away from Nyx, her teammates and objectives, dealing additional radiation damage which has a 100% status chance for radiation procs. This is of course useful as it helps you buff up your passive without really doing much aside from letting your minion do its work. For a brief window after casting the power, you can shoot your mind control target to amp up their damage. You can tell when your mind control target can receive this buff by the icon on screen swirling, and you can see how much of a buff you gave it. These things can deal impressive damage at high levels, but it's really inconsistent. It's more of a tool for drawing aggro and spreading radiation procs than anything else. I would recommend controlling heavier units, things like heavy gunners or bombards that either have a high rate of fire to inflict a lot of status procs, or AoE splash damage to do the same thing. From my testing, you can target Eximus enemies, and mind-controlled Eximuses will still use their powers. Just remember you need to break their overguard first in order to afflict them with mind control. Healers, on the other hand, don't seem to work correctly, which is a shame, but I guess having 3 Ancient Healer Spectres would be pretty strong for the ridiculous amount of DR they can kick out. Mind Control's augment, Mind Freak, is nothing special to write home about. It adds an extra 1000% damage and 25% movement and attack speed affected by strength, but again, these things aren't that consistent and it's not really worth the mod slot. Plus, you can amp up the damage just by shooting it. I've been able to get easily into 3000% damage ranges without needing to use Mind Freak at all. Nyx's second ability is where this rework kind of flies off the rails. Psychic Bolts, you shoot out 6 darts of psionic energy that fly out and home into nearby enemies. When these bolts hit a target, it debuffs them for 15 seconds multiple by duration. When debuffed, they have 80% defense reduction, this includes shields multiple by strength. Nyx gains 25 armour per enemy hit, multiple by strength up to a cap of 1000, which lasts for 20 seconds, multiple by duration, which can be refreshed by hitting another enemy with the bolts. You restore 75 shields, modified by strength. You steal 500 overguard from applicable units, multiple by strength, to a maximum cap of 7500, also multiple by strength. And you reduce the enemy's speed by 20%, multiple by strength. In addition, whenever you kill an enemy affected by the bolts, 2 more fly out to seek other enemies. Do you see what I mean when I said this power kind of flies off the rails? What was once just an armor-stripping confetti cannon is now one of the most useful tools in the game due to its ridiculous roll compression of armor strip, CC, shield regen, and overguard. Psychic Bolt's augment, Pacifying Bolts, is also really strong. Not only does it cause her to fire out 3 additional darts, it also causes all darts to inflict radiation status effects for 10 seconds multiple by duration. In my opinion, this augment is a must-have on most every build. Even if you don't want the extra darts for shield gating, it's helpful to have an extra way of spreading radiation procs even though her kit's full of it, and it's also helpful to have the extra darts flying out and debuffing other enemies, making them easier to kill. Her third power received the least changes in her kit and was already one of her strongest abilities. Chaos inflicts all enemies within 25 meters multiple by range, with 10 radiation procs for 25 seconds multiple by duration. This is your go-to way to maxing out her Thirst for Chaos. Aside from that, it acts as crowd control, an okay-ish form of survivability. It's important to note that even when enemies are affected by radiation procs, they can and will still target Nyx, so you're never truly safe. The augment then, Chaos Fear, makes it so that it creates a shrinking zone at the point of cast. Any enemy unaffected by the initial cast that wanders into that zone gets affected with the Chaos effect for half its maximum duration. It's okay in missions where you have a lot of enemies flooding to one central point, or there's a very high turnover rate in enemies, and it helps you save from having to literally sit there and spam cast 3. Game modes such as ESO, Mobile Defense, and Interception all tend to be pretty good with this augment. But it's almost never worth the mod slot in my opinion, unless you're building specifically for certain mission types or tile sets. I find it's far easier just to hit 3 twice than it is to hit 3 and wait for enemies to wander into my radius to make sure that Thirst for Chaos stays up while killing. Her final ability is Absorb, which has seen a few minor tweaks to make it more usable. Firstly, it's no longer a channeled power, instead having a duration of 5 seconds modelable by power duration. When in your absorbed state, you can move around as normal, but you can't use any weapons or parkour. You can hold shift and space to descend and ascend slowly, similar to Hildren's 4th ability. While in this state, Nyx is immune to all forms of damage, and all that damage is converted instead into a buffer. When the duration ends or the power is cancelled by recasting 4, Nyx lets out a burst of energy equal to the damage stored. Then she receives a few seconds of invincibility and a weapon damage buff up to 400%. The duration of the invincibility and the strength of the damage buff is based on the number of damage absorbed by her 4th ability, and the duration of the damage buff lasts 8 seconds and scales with duration. This is a very strange power, and kind of always has been in Nyx's kit. Her first 3 all impede enemies from dealing damage to her by either mind controlling them, causing them to fight each other, or slowing them down, or all 3 if you're using psychic bolts. So having a power which then requires mobs to shoot her in order to gain a damage buff is kind of anti-synergetic, since to get the most out of it you have to not cast any of her other powers for around 25 seconds, as that's how long Chaos lasts at base. The damage burst does very little at higher levels unless you're building it up into the millions, and other than that it's just a good knockdown tool I guess, but you're invincible. You're immune to status, you don't need a knockdown really. And the damage buff is nice, I won't say no to an extra 400% weapon damage, but the issue is the awful duration of 8 seconds. It feels like as soon as you get it, it's gone, and you have to spend another 5 seconds sat in your dumb bubble unable to kill stuff again. Absorb has 2 augments this time around, the first being the most popular, Assimilate. It turns Absorb back to a channeled power, which while active lets you walk at a reduced speed and roll, so no more flight for you. While in this state you can't crouch, so no sliding or bullet jumping either. It's very similar to Ivara's Prowl, but instead of cancelling the ability, it just refuses to let you press shift at all. This freedom of weaponry comes at a cost of halving the explosion's range, which isn't much of a sacrifice to be honest. This augment used to be the only real way to play Nyx, as her paper-thin defences would only be safe behind the Absorb bubble, but now with how good bolts are, I don't think it's really needed. It does help alleviate the issue of as soon as you lose the buff you have to go back to being useless in your bubble again, since you basically have 100% uptime with your weapons, constantly being able to shoot, and when you get up to enough damage in your buff to get the buff, you cancel, do the explosion, and then immediately go back into Absorb to keep getting that nice buff build up. So you can have fairly close to 100% uptime with it, but I really wouldn't recommend it. It's a finicky way to play, but it's a way to play for sure. The other augment is Singularity, which for the duration creates a ring every 3 seconds, which drags enemies from 15 meters away into it at a rate of 15 meters per second. Neither of these numbers are moddable. Is this a mod you can use? Sure, but far better grouping tools exist. Lava, Proboscis, Sonos, hell, even the Tenet Plinks with its alt fire, and don't get me wrong, this mod has potential when combined with Assimilate, right? It would let you group up enemies into your Assimilate bubble, hit them with melee. What do you mean they're mutually exclusive? Alright, fine, whatever, forget what I said. Absorb is not great. Let's move on to builds. So, I have 2 builds for Nyx for you today. The first is a shield gating setup, which makes use of psychic bolts to overguard and shield gate. And the second is a classic Assimilate build with access to the new tools we got in the 1999 update. Starting off with our gating build, we have subsumed off Absorb for this build and replaced it with Raw for more damage, since the only part of Absorb we really care about is the damage boost, and this lets us get a very similar damage buff without needing to absorb damage, and also it lasts for a much longer duration. It's also nice team support, and who doesn't like that? For the build then, we are running Stretch combined with Augur Reach to amp up our range to help with Chaos's functionality, Prime Continuity and Augur Message for duration to boost all of her powers, but mostly Chaos and Psychic Bolt's duration. We're running Rolling Guard for iframes to help clear status and help with shield gating, Psychic Bolts to help us afflict more mobs with debuffs as well as keep radiation procs active for Thirst of Chaos, We're also running catalyzing shields here to help with shield gating. Precision Intensify gives us more strength on Raw, and the only other power which benefits from strength here is Psychic Bolts, so if you want to, you can choose here between Precision and Umbral Intensify. Me personally, I prefer to run Umbral here for reasons we will get onto a bit later. The Aura slot can be whatever you want here. I would recommend Brief Respite or Growing Power, depending on whether you want even more survivability insurance or if you want a bit more power strength to buff up Raw and Bolts. As for Arcanes then, I'm running Molt Augmented for even more power strength, and Energize for our energy economy. Now, if you wanted to, you could swap Energize for Arcane Battery and one of the other mods here, probably either of the Auger mods, for Energy Nexus to help you with your energy sustain. This is a less consistent version of the build, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper. Onto shards then, I'm running 1 Tau Cast Speed shard, 2 Tau Strength shards, and 2 Tau Energy Max shards. These strength shards are the most important, since we need to hit 130% power strength for Psychic Bolts to fully strip enemy defenses. And as in the build the only power strength we are running is Precision Intensify, which doesn't affect her too, we need to get it from shards. Now, again, you can run 3 regular shards if you don't have 2 Tau, whatever you need to hit that 30% benchmark. The 2 energy shards are really flex slots, you can run whatever you want in here, I just prefer having more energy max. I would avoid the Radiation Topaz shards, as with Nyx's powers don't do the damage directly, so increased power strength on radiation damage targets only really buffs the damage of Absorb, which sure would work for some niche setups, but again, niche and finicky is not what we're going for here, we're going for simple strength and power. Onto the second build, our Absorb Assimilate setup. For your helmet here, I would recommend you replace your 1 with Raw, as it's a very nice damage buff and you don't find yourself casting 1 that much anyway, so you're better off getting rid of it for something better. Here we are running the titular Assimilate as well as Streamline and Fleeting Expertise to ensure we can stay in our Absorb for as long as possible, as that is our only form of survivability on this build. We're running Stretch here for more range on Chaos to maintain our passive, and Prime Continuity and Augur Message for even more duration of Raw and Chaos. Finally, we're running Augur Secrets and Umbral Intensify for even more power strength, which lets us full strip with our bolts, as well as increasing the damage buff of Raw. Aura slot is again flexible, but your best option here is going to be Growing Power, since other options like Energy Siphon doesn't work when you're channeling, and Brief Respite doesn't matter because we're using Absorb to survive anyway. For your Exiler slot, I would really recommend Mobilize or any similar mod that increases your parkour velocity. Again, your movement speed is low when you are in your Assimilate form, so having some way to increase your rolling speed is always a bonus. For Arcanes, Energize and Augmented are really strong options still, but again, if you wanted to, you could drop Energize and one other mod for Battery and Energy Nexus. So, that's the new Nyx. How does she stack up? I would say this rework took her from a D- tier Warframe to around a B tier, B+, B-, somewhere around there. Not on the same overwhelming level of power as some of the top dogs like Sevagoth, Zaku, Seren and Octavia, but no longer kicking it with Chroma down in the lower tiers. I really like her new kit. I think Psychic Bolts is a very fun tool to spam out into crowds. I think Chaos is great, her passive is fun, really incentivize you to spread that sort of radiation effect around. I like the changes they made to her 1, where it now inflicts radiation, allowing you to have a minion around constantly dealing token amounts of damage, but spreading that radiation effect to sort of build this feverish madness within a crowd. The only sticking point is, of course, Absorb and how weirdly anti-synergetic it is with the rest of her kit. I kind of wish we saw some other changes with it. I'm not sure what they would do with it is the issue, but I don't know. For me at least, it's a subsume slot. Thank you so much for watching. This was a quick video I wanted to get out during the hype of 1999 while everyone else is busy drooling over the funny numbers that Saito 9 can kick out. Wanted me to, I'm more than happy to drop another video on him next. Anyway, I will catch you in the next one.